Hello, and welcome to
Small
Small
talk
Talk
about
about
the
the
big
Big
issue.
Issue.
I'm Lorraine.
And I'm Kiara. Today's episode is very special, not only because it is the final episode in our introductory session to climate change, but also because we are joined by an outstanding guest today.
Professor Kimberly Nicholas is the author of Under the Sky We Make: How to Be Human in a Warming World, a book she published in 2021 and which became a Los Angeles Times bestseller. Kiara and I cannot overemphasize how thrilling it is to meet you today and how inspirational the book has been to this podcast. It's shaped so much of how Kiara and I think about climate change and what we can do about it. It's a brilliantly crafted story in which you present the science behind climate change and what it means for our planet, for humanity, but also for you. It's a very deeply personal story in which you recount your childhood in your family's vineyard in California, your PhD at Stanford University on the effects of climate change on the California wine industry, and your move to Sweden to become a professor of sustainability science at Lund University, which happens to be the same university Kiara is doing her master's in animal ecology in.
Yes, through your life experiences and that of the community around you, the reader follows you through a climate change journey, from approaching it from a purely academic standpoint to becoming a public climate communicator and activist. Nowadays, you combine both. You're a leading sustainability scientist in one of Europe's top universities, where you research how humans can live more sustainably. And you're also a climate change spokesperson. You regularly engage with the media, and you have a climate advice newsletter called We Can Fix It. So, all of your work aligns very closely with the aims of this podcast, and we're very honored to try and answer this question with you today. Is it too late to fight climate change? But first, we've tried to give a brief introduction of you and your work, but is there any other way that you would like to introduce yourself?
Oh, thank you too so much. That is such a kind and generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation. Maybe the only thing I would add is that I'm an avid podcast listener. So I appreciate that you're making this podcast and excited to talk more.
Great.
Yes, that's amazing. So, in the past 4 introductory episodes of this podcast, we've tried to define climate change, its causes and consequences, but also the responsibilities that we share and those that we don't. But if we have any brand new listeners with us, how would you describe in a few sentences what climate change is and what it means for us today?
Well, in almost a haiku, what the science tells us about climate change is it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. So climate change is a human-caused problem. It's primarily caused by people burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, secondarily by people destroying nature and deforestation and disturbing natural ecosystems. And those are the 2 things we have to stop doing if we want to stop climate change.
Yeah. And what is the situation today? Because you published the book in 2020. I guess a lot has happened since. What does it mean for us today to live in a warming world?
A lot has happened. So my book came out in 2021. That was over 4 years ago now. I think a big change, I dedicated my book to 2030 and said, I hope we do right by you. And it increasingly looks like humanity as a whole is not on track to do that. I read in the newspaper this morning a new study showing we only have a few years left of our carbon budget for meeting the 1.5 degree target from the Paris Agreement. And emissions are still going up, whereas they need to go down very fast for us to meet those goals. So humanity collectively, many of us are already working very hard and more each day, but we haven't yet reached this critical tipping point where we start to see the collective effects of those actions.
Yeah. You make the point that climate change is an emergency. Emergencies imply that we have to act fast. Why is there such a time pressure when it comes to climate change?
There is a time pressure because carbon is essentially forever. Some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now will be there for more than 5,000 years. And it's the longest lasting legacy that humans are writing on planet Earth. We have these ancient monuments like Stonehenge, for example, or the Great Pyramids of Giza. And those are younger than some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere still put there by people. So carbon lasts essentially forever on human timescales. And that means every liter of gasoline that we burn now, or every tree that is cut down, has a permanent impact on the possibilities for life on Earth for millennia. So that's why it's so important to turn off the tap, to stop adding climate pollution to the atmosphere, to stabilize the climate, and eventually to remove carbon and reduce the overshoot of the safe limit, which we've already breached in the climate.
Yeah.
But the most important is to stabilize first.
And going back to what you said about the study being published this morning, we also read into this, and what they basically said is that we only have 5 more years until we're very likely to reach or overshoot 1.5 degrees of global warming. In that context, how do you refute a fatalistic point of view, or people telling you that humanity is not cut out for the work we have to do?
Well, sometimes that feels true to me. I mean, I definitely have the days where I wake up and share that point of view. And every day you can certainly read news that reinforces that point of view. So it is a struggle to keep going. But I think my personal approach has been to focus on the meaning and purpose I find in the work that I do and in the community that I have and continue to build, and inspiration from other people who are working really hard and not giving up and putting all their energy and creativity into doing what the world needs. And I guess I'm a little more philosophical about the difference between process and outcome now. I think I used to be more focused on outcome, and the outcome is critically important. 1.5 degrees is a life and death difference. It's not just a hypothetical number. So it does really, really matter. But I personally, and none of us personally, can control the outcome of whether or not we reach that target, or, at which point we manage to stabilize the climate and how much damage is done along the way. So I just have to keep going and doing the things that need to be done, and encouraging and hopefully inspiring others to do the same. And I talked with someone yesterday who said, it's really a struggle to come to terms with this idea that we have to do our best and our best may not be enough. I guess that is true in all of life, and it's not an option to give up. So I guess we just keep going and find, as I said, meaning and purpose, and hopefully also fun and joy and community and creativity along the way.
Great. Thank you.
Speaking of inspiring people to make change and to be climate change activists, hopefully, in the introduction of the book, you make a point that Kara and I very much agree with and that we're trying to address with this podcast, which is that we don't talk about climate change enough. Why do you think this is the case? And more importantly, how can we have a productive conversation about climate change?
Yeah, the data on this is really surprising, given how essentially, existentially important climate change is. It's pretty shocking how rarely people talk about it in our everyday lives, how little media coverage there is compared to other things like sports and entertainment are just vastly more covered than climate change. There are, of course, some wonderful climate journalists out there and communicators working really hard. But when you look at the numbers, we have a study in preparation looking at climate communication on social media. And one of the really surprising things we found there was a single tweet by the K-pop group BTS had just millions and millions and millions of times more engagement than the collective engagement of thousands of scientists over a whole year. So, which just shows the power of entertainers who could really move the needle on climate change. And we, really need more people using those platforms for that purpose, but also just how marginal climate change is in the overall public discussion and debate. And that's a big problem. So I think having more everyday conversations about climate change is really important. I personally really believe that individual one-to-one conversations are the ways to change hearts and minds. And we need more people having those conversations in more contexts in their everyday lives to support a cultural change, which is also needed along with policy and infrastructure and economic changes to actually solve climate change. We need a culture that is ready for the kind of changes we have to make to stop burning fossil fuels and stop destroying nature. I guess to answer the question about how do we have those conversations, I mean, there's lots of research on this. I think one really important starting point is to ask questions and to listen. So it's not about having a speech prepared. You don't need, a long list of statistics. That isn't an effective way to have a conversation. That could be a good lecture if you have an invitation to give a talk. But if you're sitting down with someone over a kitchen table or going for a walk or having a coffee or at the break room or a family member, I mean, these sort of normal everyday contexts that make up most of our lives, it's really about asking questions and making it personal, making it relatable, making it connected to something that people already care about, finding those points of shared connection, and genuinely listening and approaching with curiosity and respect, and sort of realizing that it's very unlikely to be one conversation that completely changes someone's mind or decisions or approach. And I think finally, I would say the majority of people around the world already are concerned or alarmed about climate change. We know that from research. Those are the people I focus on in trying to activate and guide in taking effective climate action. It's a different story with the about 10% of people who the Yale Center for Climate Communications classifies as climate dismissives, who deny the facts of the existence of the climate crisis caused by humans burning fossil fuels and or are very resistant to acknowledging the problem exists or any kind of solutions. Those people, I think, are kind of a lost cause. And in the time it might take to productively change someone's mind, you could reach 1,000 or 10,000 other people and actually get them activated. So that is a much better use of your time.
Of course. I hope that advice goes straight to our listeners who wonder what they can do, and knowing that it starts in casual conversations. That is the one simple step you can take every day in order to spread the news, spread the knowledge, but also open people's minds about that issue that we all face every day, but that we talk too little about.
And it's very uplifting to hear that the majority of us are concerned and are hopefully willing to act. We had a question that was linked to something you said earlier, which is about cultural shifts. What kind of cultural or economic or political shifts do we need to be more effective at addressing climate change, especially in such a short amount of time?
I mean, fundamentally, I think we have to prioritize the health and well-being of humans and nature. That is the most important thing. And at the moment, we're really destroying nature and destroying human well-being through burning fossil fuels. So a culture that would allow us to break up with this destructive way of being, I think would, I don't want to say have different values, because I actually think the values we need are actually already present, that most people share a lot of these values. So it's values of care and concern for other people, for protecting the vulnerable, for fairness, and making sure that everyone has the basics that they need to have a shot at a good life. And a connection with nature, a meaningful relationship with nature, not as a source of products that we consume. Like, nature is not the fountain of stuff that we go and buy at the grocery store or online, but it's a living entity that we need to forge a sustainable relationship with. So I think those kind of cultural shifts, people do share a lot of those values. I mean, most people have an experience of, in the book I write about, where is the place you remember the feeling of sunshine on your face when you were a child? Where were you outside? And for me, I have a special beach that my family took me to through my childhood. And a lot of people have some kind of place. It can be a backyard. It can be a grandparent's cottage in the woods. It might not be a spectacular national park or, internationally known destination, but some place where you actually dug in the dirt or watched birds and insects or had some kind of tangible experience of nature. Those kind of experiences, I think, are really important as a foundation, and a connection with people. So basically a culture of connection and care for people and nature, the cultural shift.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, if people start getting aware that there's this emergency, they start to reconnect with nature and with people and realize there's a huge effort to be done to be able to tackle this crisis. what is something they can do today, and what is something they can do this year to be as efficient as possible?
Yeah, so this is the thinking exactly behind a new guide that I've developed. So it's a guide to high impact climate action, and it's an interactive guide or almost a quiz where you answer a few questions about who you are and what possibilities you have to act. And then it guides you through what actions are most effective to really move the needle on climate action and where you can start. So I can just give a few highlights from there.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough to live in a democracy, which we know is not the majority of the world and not to be taken for granted, democracy has to be continually upheld and enacted in order to remain, then your most effective actions are as a citizen. So that's voting and engaging to elect bold politicians who will enact strong climate policies. Studies have shown that voting for women and voting for politicians with good climate scores from NGO assessments does measurably reduce emissions substantially. Engaging with political parties or climate groups that are advocating for climate policy, getting media attention for climate action, for example, writing your local newspaper and putting the climate problem in a local context with local solutions. Those are some really powerful actions. So those are both, obviously voting is like a one-day activity, but being involved in identifying, supporting, cultivating strong candidates, being prepared for elections, that's ongoing work of democracy. So there's a lot to be done there.
Okay.
Linked to climate change communication, we have a question for as
Podcasters.
wannabe podcasters, which is how do we make people realize that we're in a state of emergency? Because if I look around me, I think there is climate concern, but not always a knowledge of how, or an understanding of how dire and urgent the situation is without being alarmist. Or is it necessary to be alarmist? And in that case, how do we let people face the facts without scaring them into inaction?
Great question. Well, on your first point, we know from research that actually more people care and are ready to act than we think. So everyone is kind of living in, there was a study with an amazing title. It was something like Americans are living in a self-created bubble or something like this. I'm getting that title a little bit wrong,
Yeah,
but I
we'll
can
fact
share
check
the
this.
study with you. Yes. Essentially, we know from a number of studies that people think that they care more than other people care, and people overestimate how willing I am to act and underestimate how willing others are to act. So this is a widespread phenomenon, and it's a big problem because it creates this narrative and this habit and norm of not acting and not thinking that others will support you if you act and not expecting others to act. So it's a really bad reinforcing, vicious cycle. So I guess first just being aware how strong support for climate action is a helpful basis. And then I think the communication question, we do have a lot of research that can guide us there on what kind of communication is effective. But I think the main message is you really have to have a specific target audience in mind and tailor your message just to them. So there is no such thing as the general public, for example. That's not a target audience. A target audience might be, students at Lund University who are between 20 and 25 years old. That's a group you can actually reach and message and tailor a message to and tailor your whole approach. I think the messenger is also very important. It's important to have a diverse group of messengers because people need to relate to the messenger and see someone who looks like them or can share their life experience or they find trustworthy. And that does vary between different groups of people. So there is no one size, fits all answer to, if we just had this exact message said by this person, then, problem solved. We need a lot more people with a lot more different approaches. So, I think it's worth for you as certainly not wannabe podcasters, but ongoing podcasters,
Of course.
self-actualized existing podcasters. It's worth really thinking about who is your target audience and what do they care about? What kind of messages resonate for them? What what do they think is important and interesting, and doing research on that to link with that as closely as possible, in, of course, a way that is authentic for you. I mean,
Of
you're
course.
looking for the overlap between the things you know and care about and can relate to and represent authentically, and what your target audience cares about.
Of course. Well,
Hey,
that's great advice. Thank you so much. We're only getting started and we're super excited for all the episodes we've planned ahead.
I had a follow-up question. I
Yeah.
think it's very interesting, this, and also I can see that it's very true, the fact that we need very many messengers and different messages depending on different groups. How do you reconcile this kind of diversity that we need with the fact that this is a global issue and that we all need to act cohesively in order to make an impact?
Yes, I mean, I think this can operate at different levels, because globally, of course, we do have the UN climate panel, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is top scientists from every country appointed by their governments and tasked with synthesizing and distilling down thousands and thousands of studies to this shared evidence base of what do we know about climate change. And that's both physically what's happening with the climate system, what are the causes, humans burning fossil fuels, and what can we do about it. So I think there's a very strong basis there that can be a shared international foundation. That's the world's most rigorous peer review process, including the summary for policymakers gets vetted and reviewed line by line, sentence by sentence in live session that often goes way into the night. And that's both scientifically and politically reviewed. So anything that gets into that is really, really, really robust. And all the governments of the world, as well as science evidence, stands behind it. So there is a strong basis for global action and agreement. And we have the United Nations process, including the Paris Agreement, that can and should be guiding action. That said, in 2025, I am not seeing a lot of evidence of international cooperation and cohesion, unfortunately. And I think we therefore have to put a lot of thought and strategy and effort into local, regional, national action. It's always been true that any one of us has the biggest potential contribution to give on the local level. And if you want to start somewhere, that is probably the most effective place to start. You have a chance of getting a face-to-face meeting with your local city council representative or someone on your local transport planning authority, much more so than starting with knocking on the door of Parliament as your first political action. So I think engaging with local groups, reaching out and finding out who's already active in the area is a really important step. I mean, many people sort of, I would say first seek to support and help groups that already exist, that are already working on the problem, rather than kind of starting out on your own or starting with a new initiative, just because it's not a shortage of good ideas that is stopping us from addressing climate change, but it's about organizing and using the strengths that we have more effectively. And there are a lot of groups already that have built relationships, that understand the local context, that are working on campaigns that would be more effective with more support.
I think you make very strong points about how our social community can actually put this change into action. I was wondering, in your book, you also mention a few, home-based solutions that you try to implement in your daily life. I guess a lot of people are wondering how efficient their small climate-aware actions are. Is there anything you would recommend doing? To what extent do our little daily actions, like saving water or putting less air conditioning on, help to actually tackle the crisis in a very practical way?
Yeah, so I'll say that for 90% of people on Earth, they don't need to reduce their carbon footprint. Most people actually have a relatively low carbon footprint, and there's even about 1 billion people who have room to increase their carbon footprint, who are so poor at the moment that they consume hardly any resources in a way that's limiting their health and potential for a good life. So the very poorest have a right and deserve the opportunity to increase their consumption to a level where their material needs are met. Fortunately, that actually doesn't increase emissions very much, because that level of consumption is still so low. So 90% of people don't need to worry about their carbon footprint if we succeed in making these political, economic, social changes that get us off of fossil fuels and in a sustainable relationship with nature. Their level of consumption will be supported.
Okay.
However, most of us actually belong to the remaining 10%. So most people in countries like Sweden, Germany, countries in Western Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, those are countries where the majority of people are in this global top 10%. And unfortunately, there's an extremely strong link between income and climate pollution. So that is something we need to break. It can't be
Yeah.
the case that economic development comes at the cost of climate. It's interesting from a student perspective because students' life is often very sustainable because you don't have a lot of money. So it's worth thinking about how to maintain the things that really bring joy and happiness and increase your health and well-being and security when you do get a job and probably have more income and more opportunity to spend more money. So basically, for this top 10%, which I certainly belong to, in the cutoff is earning over 38,000 US dollars per year. So that is below many starting salaries for college graduates, for example. So for that group, the most important thing to do is to reduce flying. Flying makes up the biggest part of an individual's carbon footprint for a high emitting individual who needs to reduce our own footprints. That's about 40% for the highest emitters of the footprint comes from flying. About 20% for that group comes from driving. So essentially, if we think about, okay, we have to cut climate pollution in half and then in half again and then in half again, we won't get anywhere near the first half if we don't reduce driving and flying for that highest emitting group. So those are by far the most important places to start. The other high impact actions there would be to change the energy source for home heating and cooling. So to run your house on renewable energy, for example, installing solar panels or supporting some community solar projects, and to eat a plant-based diet. So I think those are the things that really move the needle. Those are actually the only things I recommend focusing on. I think everything else is kind of gravy. And if you can focus on doing those four things, then you should move on to other domains. So it's much better to get politically involved, to move your money out of fossil banks that are supporting fossil infrastructure that's causing the climate crisis,
Of course.
to influence others. I'd much rather, and it's just much, much, much more effective to focus on taking those actions in other domains than to, get more and more fine-grained on the smaller and smaller home-based actions that will have less and less impact.
What you say is really interesting. Also, highlighting the fact that most of us listening, and also like at university or in our countries in Europe, America, Japan, that we are part of a global 10%. And when you think about it, when you think about all the actions you have to take, you sometimes think, oh, I'm just 1 out of 7 billion. The part that I play is not big enough. My own changes will not have that big of an impact. But thinking of yourself as part of a smaller community, one that has a huge legacy, a big responsibility when it comes to changing the climate, then it puts things into perspective and it makes you realize that actually you bear more responsibility than most of the humans on Earth. And that's something to first understand and then to start to live with. And living with that fact, actually, I think I find it personally makes me want to change my lifestyle way more than thinking that I'm just 1 out of 7 billion people.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's super interesting. I mean, it's really important to know the data there. And I really recommend a website called Dollar Street. And it comes from Hans Rosling and his family and their legacy and work. So really visualizing the way people live around the world and kind of realizing they talk about the 4 levels of material of income and sort of material wealth. And it's just really striking to see, okay, these 1 billion people who live on very, very little money, less than a couple of dollars a day. I mean, they don't have shoes. They don't have running water. They're walking, kilometers a day to collect water. They're cooking over an open fire with a lot of health hazards. They don't have enough safe shelter and nutritious food. It's just such a basic standard of living. A lot of the world, about 5 billion people, live in the global middle class of the standard of living of India or China. But that's also still a very, very modest lifestyle compared to this top 10%, which is where I grew up in California, where I live now in Sweden, sort of the standard that I'm used to. But realizing that this taken for granted middle class Western lifestyle is in fact in the top global 10% is really, really eye-opening. And you're right, it does mean that those of us in this group have more power than we realize.
We also had a question about the role of scientists in climate change. I think one of the sentences that most struck me in the opening of the book is that we have enough science. We don't need more science to fix climate change. And as a scientist, this was the first time I'd heard anything of the sort. Keeping that in mind, and I think I fully understand your point, which is now that we understand climate change and we have resources to fix it, we know how to make clean energy. What is the role of science and scientists in furthering climate action and awareness?
Yes, I mean, I hope it's clear. I love science. I support science. I want there to exist science. I want scientists to be free to study and report on what we want. And that academic freedom is not something to take for granted. I think as I wrote there, I want to activate people who are not scientists, which is of course the majority of people, to realize, okay, it's not someone else's job to fix this now. The scientists and engineers have done their jobs. And of course, there's still room for a need for innovation research. But it's not the case that some futuristic tech breakthrough is going to be the thing that saves us. We have to save ourselves now. We have to use what science has already found and discovered and developed and made reality in terms of, the tech that we need for renewable energy, for example, that exists. And it's cheaper than the alternatives that are destroying the climate in many, many cases. So just to highlight that, it's not a problem for a different group of people to fix. So I think that the role of science is still really important. And it's something I personally have struggled with sometimes because, as we've been discussing, the climate crisis is an emergency. It's urgent. We need to act fast. That isn't really science's strength. Science can move slowly. The process of peer review takes time. Grants take years to write and receive and get started and hire students to do research. And I mean, it is a slow process, and that I personally have found really frustrating at times. I also think that the world does need scientists and universities. We need places where we discover new things, where we test new ideas, where we train students, and where we can think freely about the long-term future of humanity, because there is no other sector that's doing that. I think it's increasingly clear that private sector does not necessarily have humanity's best interests at heart. The tech pros are not going to save us or not going to deliver a utopia that is automatically fair and just and good for everyone. So we need people who are working on those problems. And I do think scientists have an important role there to think big, to focus on some blue sky thinking and make use of that privilege and luxury that we have to not necessarily focus on quarterly returns for our shareholders. That's not how the university works. We're not about getting reelected every 4 years. So we should use the strength and power that we have to put forward new ideas, to assemble what's known in a way that people can make use of all this scientific research and help support the change that's needed. And I think research shows that scientists are highly trusted. Trust in general is unfortunately in decline, and institutions are becoming less trusted. We're in a time of cultural and political upheaval, I think, is pretty clear. So that is felt in many ways, including in a general decline in trust in many societies. But nonetheless, scientists are still a highly trusted group, and the public wants to hear from scientists. The public wants people who know stuff and have expertise to use that expertise in the public interest. So I think there's a lot of scope for scientists to be involved in public discussions and debates and moving the needle forward on taking high impact climate action.
So we need more scientists speaking up and spreading their facts in a time where they're actually some of the highest trusted groups of people in society, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
And
Okay.
that can be a part of the diverse voices that we need, as we talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
Now, what's a question that you wish you were asked more as a climate scientist, or something that you wish was spoken more about? Take your time.
I guess something I think about a lot is why haven't we succeeded already? And what is standing in the way of success? There was a paper a few years ago called Why Haven't We Bent the Curve? And meaning the curve of emissions, which is still going up and it needs to go down. And I think it's really worth thinking about and understanding that the forces that prevent change. And some of these are structural, but some of them are active resistance. I mean, there are industries and people who benefit from the current status quo. They're really strategic and they have a lot of money and they're really good at preventing change. So we have a lot of evidence now of, in many, many ways, how the fossil fuel industry has denied and delayed and discredited the facts and tried to prevent a threat to their business model. And I think it's important to understand the money and power and incentives behind the lack of change. So we have to, I guess something to talk about more is my theory of change, how change happens, and this idea of transitions happening on two tracks at once. You have to dismantle the old system while you scale up the new. And these things are really mirror images of each other. So you don't get, it's not that you just have a good idea or a good solution and laissez-faire or the market or the existing conditions will just allow it to flourish and take over. You actually have to create cracks in the unsustainable system through problematizing it, through discussing the damage that it's causing, through changing rules and incentives and regulations that currently really tilt the playing field in an unfair way to create space for the good alternatives to take over.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing. And we hope we've given you the stage to speak about things that are not usually mentioned enough and that you think are worth talking about.
If we start maybe wrapping up this episode, if you had to kind of summarize the question that we've tried to answer, is it too late to do anything about climate change?
Can we fix it?
So, yes and no, to be honest. I mean, is it too late to avoid a lot of unnecessary suffering? Yes, because it's already happening. I mean, my family was evacuated from wildfire that was made much more likely by humans burning fossil fuels. And that happened in 2017 and almost happened again in 2020 in California for where my family lives. And of course, many others continue to suffer impacts that could have been avoided. So if we think of the possible responses to climate change as preventing it from happening, preparing for its impacts and that we can't avoid, and suffering, we've unfortunately so far chosen a lot of suffering that was unnecessary. And there is more suffering baked in as long as we continue to burn fossil fuels. So yes, it's too late for the very best outcomes because we've burned too many fossil fuels. We've missed some of the best pathways and made things harder for ourselves. We've dug the hole deeper. But is it too late to change course? Is it too late to stop? Absolutely not. So it's this real dilemma of understanding and having our eyes open to the real harm that's already been done and not turning away from that harm and suffering, while also recognizing how much more is up for grabs, is on the table, is available to be, to be won. And the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best is today. So no one can change the past. Of course, we need to learn from it and understand it in order to make good choices going forward. But we do have a lot of opportunity now. And something that is, relatively recent, or has changed from when I was in graduate school, is that our understanding that the climate should stop warming very quickly as soon as we stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. Within a year or so, the climate will stabilize. So we will see the effects of our actions much more quickly than we thought. So that is encouraging. And we don't have this expectation of a lot of baked in warming that hasn't happened yet. We realize now how quickly the climate responds to the climate pollution that humans produce. So it is definitely not too late to stabilize the climate and to repair. Will it happen fully in my lifetime? I don't think so. I mean, this is a generational project, and it's the most important and meaningful thing any of us can do with our time on Earth. We need more people involved in the work. We need people from every background, from every ability, from every perspective, because it's a really, really big problem. But humans absolutely have the capacity to fix it, and I hope that we do.
So do we. I think Kiara and I maybe were prepared to hear that answer because of our previous episodes, but it can be quite grim to hear some parts of your answers. In Under the Sky We Make, you discuss how to deal with climate feels, what you call climate feels. And so at the end of every episode, we try and recommend to our audience one extra resource that they can take their time to investigate. So for this episode, of course, we recommend Under the Sky We Make. Are there, just as a last question, are there any additional resources that you would recommend people have a look at? You've mentioned some already, but if there were one thing people could do after listening to this episode, what would you recommend they do?
I would love people to take our high impact climate action guide and get started on those actions. Right now, you can find it on my Substack on wecanfixit.substack.com. It's the high impact climate action guide. And soon we will be relaunching it, an even bigger and better version. But, all the steps are there. So I think taking those actions is really important. You just mentioned the climate, facing the emotional side and dealing with all the feels of the climate crisis, which is also important to stay in this work, to stay healthy, to take care of yourself and each other. I think the Good Grief Network has a really good program. Britt Ray has an excellent book and newsletter. There are a lot of climate psychologists and mental health professionals who are doing a lot of great work in that space to support us and sort of build our resilience and tolerance for a really tough situation that we find ourselves in. And I think ways of creating meaning from suffering is just an existential part of being human. And the climate crisis offers us that opportunity. And it's something really wonderful, actually, to do with our time on Earth.
Thank you. We'll definitely have a look at those. And thank you for being here today. Thank you for your time. It's been, as expected, very insightful to talk to you, but also on a personal level, very inspiring.
Thank you, Kara. What a treat. I really appreciate talking to both of you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
No, thanks to
Thank
you.
you.